Welcome to Shadows of America, where history's darkest secrets come to light. In the fall of 1888, in the historic Massachusetts town of Salem, head librarian Mr. Edmund Ashford was found dead in the restricted archive section of the Salem Public Library from what appeared to be a heart attack. Ashford had served as the library's head librarian for 16 years, overseeing the institution's collections, managing staff, and maintaining the historical archives that documented Salem's colonial and Revolutionary War history. His death seemed to be a natural tragedy of a dedicated professional who had died doing the work he loved. But when library trustees began the process of inventorying the archives to prepare for hiring a new head librarian, they discovered something that would shock Salem's scholarly community and would call into question the integrity of 16 years of historical documentation. Hundreds of books in the library's collection, particularly historical texts, biographies, and local history volumes, had been systematically altered by Edmund Ashford, who had spent 16 years rewriting passages, inserting false information, and destroying original content to conform to his personal ideological beliefs and to his revisionist interpretation of history. The alterations were extensive and sophisticated. Ashford had carefully removed original pages from books and had replaced them with his own handwritten or typed pages that matched the original book's formatting and appearance closely enough that casual readers wouldn't notice the substitutions. He had used period-appropriate paper and ink to make his alterations blend with original text. He had even damaged some of his inserted pages to make them appear aged and original rather than recent editions. The result was that hundreds of books in Salem's library contained false information presented as original historical text, corrupting the library's collection and potentially spreading misinformation to scholars and students who had used these books for research. Ashford's journals, found in his private office in the archive, documented his 16-year project of what he called historical correction, systematically altering books to remove or revise information he considered historically inaccurate or morally problematic, and inserting information that reflected his own understanding of how history should be presented. The journals revealed that Edmund Ashford had believed he was improving the historical record by removing lies and distortions, and by ensuring that future generations would have access to what he considered the truth, even though his truth was based on personal ideology rather than on historical evidence. The discovery raised profound questions about the integrity of historical documentation, about the trust society places in librarians and archivists to preserve rather than alter the records in their care, and about how much damage one person with systematic access to important collections could do over 16 years of deliberate falsification. Edmund Ashford had betrayed every principle of his profession, had corrupted one of New England's important historical collections, and had potentially influenced the research of hundreds of scholars who had used the altered books without knowing they contained false information. Before we continue with the complete investigation into Edmund Ashford and the 16 years he spent systematically rewriting books in Salem's library, subscribe to Shadows of America. We release documentaries daily, because what was found in those archives raises disturbing questions about the preservation of truth, about the power that librarians and archivists hold over our access to history, and about how easily the historical record can be corrupted when those trusted to protect it choose instead to alter it according to their personal beliefs. Salem, Massachusetts, in the 1870s and 1880s, was a historic city with a population of approximately 25,000 people, known for its colonial history, for its role in the American Revolution, and notoriously for the 1692 witch trials that had made Salem's name synonymous with hysteria and injustice. The city took pride in its historical significance and in its collections of documents and books relating to American colonial history. The Salem Public Library, established in 1810, was one of the oldest public libraries in America and housed important historical materials, including rare books, manuscripts, and local archives. Edmund Ashford had been appointed head librarian of the Salem Public Library in 1872 at age 38. After working as an assistant librarian for several years, and after demonstrating exceptional knowledge of the library's collections and strong organizational skills, his appointment had been celebrated by the library's trustees and by Salem's scholarly community, who valued his apparent dedication to preserving and cataloging the library's historical materials. Ashford was a widower with no children, devoted himself completely to his work, and was known as a stern but competent professional who maintained high standards for the library's operations. But Ashford's journals reveal that, from early in his tenure as head librarian, he had been troubled by what he viewed as historical inaccuracies and moral problems in books within the library's collection. The journals document his growing conviction that many historical texts contained lies, distortions, and morally problematic content that needed to be corrected to prevent false information from misleading future generations. Ashford believed that as head librarian, he had a responsibility not just to preserve books as they were, but to ensure that the information they contained was accurate and morally appropriate, according to his understanding. The specific content that troubled Ashford varied, but followed patterns related to his particular ideological beliefs. He was disturbed by historical accounts that portrayed colonial America in negative terms, believing that such accounts were unpatriotic and harmful. He objected to biographical information about historical figures that revealed their flaws or failings, believing that heroes should be presented as morally exemplary rather than as complex humans with both virtues and vices. He was troubled by historical discussions of slavery, Native American treatment, and religious conflict, believing that such difficult historical topics were better minimized or presented in ways that emphasized American exceptionalism rather than acknowledging historical injustices. Ashford's first documented alteration occurred in 1873, less than a year after he became head librarian. He removed pages from a biography of Samuel Adams that discussed his financial troubles and his sometimes harsh treatment of political opponents, replacing those pages with his own text that presented Adams as an unblemished patriot without personal flaws. His first alteration had excited Ashford, according to his journals. Because it had been successful, no one had noticed the substituted pages, and the altered book had continued to circulate without anyone questioning its authenticity. Encouraged by this success, Ashford had begun systematically identifying books he wanted to alter and had developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for making alterations that wouldn't be detected. He learned bookbinding skills that allowed him to remove and replace pages without leaving obvious signs of tampering. He experimented with papers and inks to find materials that would match original books well enough to fool casual inspection. He studied period printing and handwriting styles to make his inserted pages appear authentic. Over 16 years, Ashford became expert at book alteration, developing skills that would have been valuable for preservation and restoration work, but that he applied instead to systematic falsification. The scope of Ashford's alterations was staggering. The post-discovery inventory identified more than 500 books that had been altered, with the total number of altered pages exceeding 3,000. The alterations ranged from minor deletions of a few sentences to complete replacement of entire chapters with Ashford's rewritten versions. Some books had multiple alterations spread throughout, making them more fabrication than original text. The altered books included important historical works, biographies of significant figures, and local history volumes that researchers had relied upon for accurate information about Salem and Massachusetts history. The types of alterations Ashford made followed consistent patterns. He removed or revised passages that portrayed American historical figures negatively or that acknowledged their human failings. He minimized or eliminated discussions of historical injustices, including slavery, Native American displacement, and religious persecution. He altered accounts of controversial historical events to present them in ways that supported his particular interpretation of American history as fundamentally virtuous and exceptional. He inserted passages that emphasized religious and moral themes that he believed were important, but that weren't present in original texts. In every case, Ashford's alterations moved historical accounts away from complex reality towards simplified, ideologically driven narratives that aligned with his beliefs about how history should be presented. Ashford's journals documented his awareness that what he was doing violated professional ethics and would be condemned if discovered. He wrote about his precautions to avoid detection, about limiting alterations to books that were rarely examined in detail, and about his fears that careful scholars might notice inconsistencies or anachronisms in his inserted text. But the journals also documented his conviction that his work was morally necessary despite being professionally forbidden, that he was performing a service to future generations by correcting the historical record, and that his superior understanding of history justified his violation of trust placed in him as librarian. This rationalization that personal conviction justified professional betrayal allowed Ashford to continue his alterations for 16 years, while maintaining his professional reputation and while apparently experiencing no significant guilt about systematically corrupting the library's collection. His journals show someone who had convinced himself that he was the hero of his story, correcting errors and protecting truth, rather than recognizing himself as the villain who was destroying historical documentation and spreading false information. The discovery of Ashford's alterations triggered a crisis for the Salem Public Library and for the broader scholarly community that had relied on Salem's collections. Every book in the library's collection that Ashford had access to became suspect. How could scholars be certain that any particular book hadn't been altered? Books that had been cited in published research might contain false information that had been inserted by Ashford, meaning that scholarly work based on those books might itself contain errors. The integrity of the entire collection was compromised by Ashford's 16 years of systematic falsification. The process of identifying all altered books and of attempting to restore original text was daunting. The library trustees formed a special committee, including bibliographers, historians, and book restoration experts, to examine the collection systematically. The committee used several methods to identify alterations, comparing Salem's copies of books against copies from other libraries, to identify discrepancies, examining physical evidence of page replacement or text insertion, and cross-referencing suspicious passages against other historical sources to identify content that appeared inconsistent with period knowledge or writing styles. The restoration effort was complicated by several factors. Some altered books existed only in Salem's library, with no other copies available for comparison, making it impossible to determine exactly what original text had been removed. Some of Ashford's alterations were so skillfully done that they were difficult to detect even under careful examination, and some books had been damaged by Ashford's alterations in ways that made restoration to original condition impossible, meaning those books were permanently corrupted by his actions. The investigation into how Ashford had been able to alter so many books over 16 years without detection revealed systematic failures of oversight and of preservation practices. As head librarian, Ashford had unrestricted access to the collections, including to rare books and archives that were supposed to be carefully controlled. He worked long hours in the library, often alone in the archives, after regular hours when no one else was present to observe what he was doing. The library's procedures didn't include regular auditing of collections against catalogs, didn't require multiple people to handle rare materials, and didn't have systems for detecting unauthorized alterations. These inadequate safeguards had allowed Ashford to operate freely, systematically corrupting the collection, while his professional reputation shielded him from suspicion. The harm caused by Ashford's alterations extended beyond the Salem Library's collection. Scholars had used Salem's books for research, had cited information from altered books in published works, and had potentially spread false information that Ashford had inserted into supposedly authoritative historical texts. Identifying all scholarship that might have been affected by Ashford's alterations was impossible. The library couldn't determine which scholars had used which books, or what information from those books had influenced published research. This meant that Ashford's falsifications had potentially corrupted not just Salem's collection, but the broader historical scholarship that had relied on that collection. The question of what had motivated Edmund Ashford to spend 16 years systematically altering books was partially answered by his journals, but remained mysterious in important ways. The journals documented his stated beliefs about historical accuracy and moral improvement, but they didn't fully explain why he had felt such intense compulsion to correct books rather than simply disagreeing with them and advocating for different historical interpretations through legitimate scholarly channels. Modern psychological understanding might suggest that Ashford had obsessive traits combined with grandiose beliefs about his own superior understanding that led him to believe he had both the right and the duty to unilaterally rewrite history according to his beliefs. The ideological content of Ashford's alterations reflected particular strains of late 19th century American thought, including emphasis on American exceptionalism, resistance to acknowledging historical injustices, and discomfort with complexity and moral ambiguity in historical narratives. These ideological positions weren't unusual or extreme for his time period. Many Americans in the 1880s held similar beliefs. What was extreme and unusual was Ashford's decision to act on these beliefs by systematically falsifying historical texts rather than engaging in normal debate and interpretation of history. The parallel between Ashford's alterations and legitimate scholarly editing and annotation raised questions about the boundaries between appropriate scholarly interpretation and inappropriate falsification. Scholars routinely interpret historical texts, emphasize some aspects while minimizing others, and present historical events in ways shaped by their perspectives and values. The difference between legitimate scholarship and what Ashford did was that legitimate scholarship is transparent about its interpretive nature and doesn't present itself as being the original historical text, while Ashford's alterations were concealed and were presented as being original historical documentation when they were actually his fabrications. The legal questions about whether Ashford had committed crimes were complicated. The books he had altered were library property, so he had damaged public property, but statutes specifically criminalizing such alteration were unclear. He had created false documents and had potentially defrauded scholars who had relied on the authenticity of the library's collection, but again existing fraud statutes weren't clearly applicable. The fact that Ashford had died before discovery of his alterations meant that criminal prosecution was moot, but the legal questions remained relevant for considering how to prevent and punish similar actions in the future. The impact on Salem's scholarly and library communities was severe. The library's reputation as a trustworthy repository of historical materials was severely damaged, with scholars reluctant to rely on Salem's collections even after the restoration effort attempted to identify and correct alterations. Other libraries and archives conducted reviews of their own practices and collections, wondering whether their institutions might be vulnerable to similar corruption. The case created lasting distrust and paranoia about the authenticity of historical collections, with scholars and librarians recognizing how vulnerable such collections were to alteration by insiders with access and with technical skills. The library staff who had worked under Ashford's supervision experienced particular trauma and self-blame. They wondered whether they should have noticed that Ashford was spending unusual amounts of time with particular books, whether they should have questioned his working alone in archives after hours, whether warning signs had been present that they had missed. The staff members' reputations were also damaged by association with Ashford's corruption, with some having difficulty finding new library positions because other institutions worried they might have been complicit in or aware of the alterations. The trustees who had hired Ashford and had overseen his work for 16 years faced harsh criticism for failing to maintain adequate oversight. The trustees defended themselves by noting that Ashford had been a respected professional with appropriate credentials, that his work had appeared competent, and that the specific concern about systematic alteration of books wasn't something they would have thought to guard against, since it was such an unusual form of professional misconduct. But critics argued that proper oversight should have included regular audits and controls that would have detected Ashford's alterations, even if they weren't specifically anticipated. The restoration project to identify and correct Ashford's alterations took more than 3 years, and required examining tens of thousands of books from the library's collection. The project was expensive, requiring hiring additional staff, including bibliographers and book restoration experts, and requiring purchasing copies of books from other libraries for comparison purposes. The Salem Public Library faced significant financial strain from the restoration costs, leading to reduced acquisition of new materials and reduced programming, while resources were diverted to repairing damage Ashford had caused. The few altered books that could be restored to original condition underwent careful conservation work to remove Ashford's inserted pages and to reattach original pages where possible. But many books had been damaged beyond full restoration. Original pages had been destroyed rather than just removed, making it impossible to recover original text. These permanently damaged books had to be replaced with copies from other libraries when such copies could be obtained, or had to be marked as unreliable when replacement copies weren't available. The permanent loss of original materials was one of Ashford's most damaging legacies. The question of what to do with the altered pages that were removed from books was debated. Some argued for preservation as evidence of Ashford's systematic falsification and as material for studying how historical texts can be corrupted. Others argued for destruction, viewing the altered pages as fraudulent materials that shouldn't be preserved. Eventually, the removed pages were bound into separate volumes marked clearly as Ashford alterations and were preserved in the library's archives with restricted access, allowing researchers to study the alterations while preventing the altered content from being confused with authentic historical material. Modern archival and library science programs teach the Ashford case as a cautionary example of insider threats to collections and of the importance of implementing controls that prevent any single person from having unchecked access to altered materials. The case contributed to development of professional standards, including requirements for multiple person handling of rare materials, regular auditing of collections against catalogs, environmental monitoring that tracks who accesses what materials, and preservation practices that make unauthorized alterations more difficult and more detectable. The impact on historical scholarship that had relied on Salem's library was significant but difficult to quantify precisely. Several published works that had cited altered books were identified, and their authors were notified, leading to published corrections in some cases. but many works that might have been affected by Ashford's alterations were never identified, meaning that false information Ashford had inserted into books might have been incorporated into historical scholarship and might continue to be repeated in subsequent works that relied on that scholarship. The cascading effect of falsified sources being cited and repeated demonstrated how corrupting historical collections could have impacts far beyond the immediate collection where falsification occurred. The psychological profile of Edmund Ashford that emerged from his journals and from accounts of people who had known him suggested someone with rigid ideological beliefs, with grandiose sense of his own judgment, with obsessive dedication to his project of historical correction, and with apparently limited empathy for scholars and students who would be harmed by being given false information. These characteristics, combined with his position of trust and his technical skills in book alteration, had created the perfect conditions for systematic falsification to continue undetected for 16 years. The question of whether Ashford's beliefs about historical accuracy might have been correct in some cases, whether some of the information he removed might genuinely have been erroneous, and whether some of his corrections might have improved accuracy, was considered but ultimately rejected as irrelevant. Even if Ashford had sometimes corrected genuine errors, his method of secretly altering books without documentation or transparency was fundamentally inappropriate and destructive, regardless of whether his alterations happened to improve accuracy in particular cases. The integrity of historical documentation depends on knowing that texts are original and authentic, not on trusting individual librarians' judgments about what information is correct. The comparison between Ashford's alterations and modern concerns about digital information manipulation raised questions about whether digital formats might be more or less vulnerable to corruption than physical books. Digital text can be altered easily and changes might be difficult to detect, suggesting vulnerability similar to what Ashford had exploited. But digital formats also allow for tracking changes, maintaining version histories, and creating multiple distributed copies that make undetected alteration more difficult. The Ashford case highlighted that no format is inherently secure against determined falsification, and that protection depends on implementing appropriate controls and oversight regardless of format. The memorial erected by the American Library Association in 1895, honoring librarians who died in service, explicitly notes the Ashford case as an example of professional betrayal, stating, "The sacred trust of preserving the record must never be corrupted by personal belief. We honor those who protected what was entrusted to them, and we remember those who failed this duty so we might learn from their failings." This unusual inclusion of a negative example in a memorial reflected the ALA's determination that the Ashford case should serve as lasting reminder of professional responsibilities. The few letters that survived from scholars who had used Salem's library and who later learned that books they had relied upon had been altered by Ashford express feelings of betrayal, anger, and anxiety about whether their published work contained errors based on false information. Some scholars conducted extensive reviews of their work to identify any reliance on potentially altered sources. Others published corrections or retractions after discovering they had cited altered books. The scholarly community's response emphasized the fundamental importance of source authenticity for historical research and the catastrophic damage that source corruption can cause. The impact on Salem's library lasted for decades. The institution's reputation for having trustworthy historical collections took years to rebuild. Donor support declined significantly after the scandal, as donors questioned whether their gifts of rare books and documents would be properly preserved. Researcher traffic to the library dropped as scholars chose to use other institutions' collections rather than risk relying on potentially corrupted materials. The library didn't fully recover its pre-scandal reputation until well into the 20th century, decades after Ashford's death, and after the restoration project had concluded. The question of whether similar corruption might exist in other libraries and archives became a source of ongoing concern. The library community recognized that if one trusted head librarian had systematically corrupted his collection over 16 years without detection, similar corruption could exist elsewhere undetected. This realization led to increased vigilance, but also to recognition that perfect detection of insider threats was impossible. Institutions would always depend significantly on professional integrity of staff who had access to collections, making it crucial to carefully screen and supervise staff and to implement multiple layers of controls. The archive of Edmund Ashford's journals is preserved in sealed records with restricted access, available only to researchers with specific approved purposes. Scholars studying information integrity, library science ethics, and historical methodology have accessed these materials, reporting that they provide detailed documentation of systematic falsification spanning 16 years. The journal's preservation allows continued study of how and why Ashford corrupted the collection while restricting access to prevent the journals from being used as a manual for similar misconduct. The lessons from the Ashford case remain relevant in contemporary discussions about preservation of historical records, about the responsibilities of archivists and librarians, about how to balance access with security, and about how to maintain public trust in institutions that preserve society's documentary heritage. The case demonstrated that preservation requires not just protecting materials from physical deterioration, but also protecting them from deliberate alteration by insiders who might prioritize personal beliefs over professional duties. The professional consequences for the library field extended beyond Salem to include re-examination of professional ethics codes, development of new preservation standards, and increased emphasis on the duty to maintain authentic materials rather than to improve them according to personal judgments. The case contributed to a shift toward recognizing preservation of original materials as paramount, even when those materials contained content that individual librarians or archivists might find problematic or objectionable. The question of what additional alterations Ashford might have made, beyond those that were discovered, remained a source of ongoing concern. The restoration project had identified alterations in books that were examined carefully, but hadn't had the resources or methodology to exhaustively examine every book in the collection. It remained possible that some of Ashford's alterations went undetected, meaning that the Salem Library's collection might still contain corrupted materials that continue to mislead researchers. This uncertainty created lasting anxiety about the collection's reliability. The financial impact of Ashford's actions included not only the direct costs of the restoration project, but also the opportunity costs of donations not made, research not conducted, and reputation not rebuilt. Economic analysis estimated that the total costs exceeded $100,000 in 1890s dollars, an enormous sum representing years of normal library budgets. This financial burden affected the library's ability to serve its community and to fulfill its mission, demonstrating how professional misconduct creates rippling harms extending far beyond immediate victims. The few photographs of Edmund Ashford show a stern man with grey beard and wire-rimmed spectacles, looking every bit the respectable Victorian scholar with his formal dark clothing and serious demeanor. The photographs illustrate how professional appearance and manner can mask unethical behavior, and how trust based on professional credentials and respectable presentation can be betrayed by those who prioritize personal ideology over professional integrity. The building that housed the Salem Public Library in Ashford's era was eventually replaced by a new library building in the early 20th century. Some library supporters argued for a new building, partly to symbolically leave behind the Ashford scandal and to start fresh in a new space not associated with corruption. The old building was converted to other municipal uses and eventually demolished, removing the physical space where Ashford had conducted his 16-year project of systematic falsification. The descendants of Edmund Ashford, including a nephew who had been his only living relative, largely declined to discuss him or his actions, apparently viewing him as an embarrassing family legacy best not acknowledged. This silence prevented gathering of additional biographical information that might have provided insight into what personal history or psychology had led Ashford to develop his obsessive project of historical correction. The impact on professional literature about archival ethics and information integrity was substantial. The case appears in numerous textbooks and professional articles as an example of severe professional misconduct and as a case study for discussing responsibilities of information professionals. The case is used to illustrate the importance of transparency, of maintaining authentic materials, of implementing controls against insider threats, and of recognizing that personal beliefs, no matter how sincerely held, do not justify altering historical records to conform to those beliefs. The broader cultural impact of the Ashford case on American attitudes toward libraries and archives is difficult to measure, but probably contributed to greater public awareness of the vulnerability of historical collections and of the trust society places in librarians and archivists to maintain rather than alter materials. While libraries and archives remain generally trusted institutions, the Ashford case served as a reminder that such trust required vigilance and accountability rather than blind faith in professional integrity. The memorial to scholars who were harmed by Ashford's alterations, erected in the Salem Library's reading room in 1900, acknowledges those whose work was corrupted by false information presented as truth, and commits to vigilance in preserving authentic materials so that such corruption shall not occur again. The memorial serves as ongoing reminder of professional responsibilities and of consequences when those responsibilities are betrayed. Modern digital humanities projects that seek to create authoritative digital editions of historical texts often reference the Ashford case when discussing the importance of documenting editorial decisions, maintaining transparency about any changes or corrections made to texts, and preserving original materials alongside any enhanced or corrected versions. The case illustrates why scholarly editions must clearly distinguish between original text and editorial additions or corrections, rather than silently incorporating changes as Ashford had done. The question of whether information intermediaries, including librarians, archivists, editors, and publishers, have responsibilities beyond just providing access to information, and whether they have duties to somehow ensure accuracy or appropriateness of information, remains debated. The Ashford case is sometimes invoked in these debates as an example of what can go wrong when intermediaries believe they have authority and responsibility to alter information based on their personal judgments, rather than preserving and providing access to original materials for users to evaluate themselves. The case of Edmund Ashford and his 16 years of systematically rewriting books in Salem's library stands as one of the most extensive documented cases of deliberate corruption of a historical collection by a trusted insider. The more than 500 books he altered, the thousands of pages he rewrote, and the unknown number of scholars and students who were misled by his falsifications represent catastrophic betrayal of the trust placed in librarians to preserve rather than alter the materials in their care. The scholars and students who used altered books from Salem's library, who cited false information in their work, and who potentially spread Ashford's fabrications through their scholarship, experienced harm that in many cases was never fully identified or corrected. Some learned of the alterations and were able to correct their work. Others may never have known that sources they relied upon had been corrupted, meaning that false information Ashford inserted into historical texts may continue circulating in scholarship built upon those corrupted sources. What happened in that Salem Library archive between 1872 and 1888, the systematic removal of original pages from hundreds of books, the insertion of fabricated text designed to appear original, the 16-year project of historical correction that actually represented historical falsification, stands as testament to how vulnerable documentary heritage is to corruption by insiders with access and with technical skills, to how professional authority can be exploited to advance personal ideology, and to why preservation of information requires not just protecting materials from physical harm, but also protecting them from deliberate alteration by those who believe their personal beliefs justify rewriting the historical record. Edmund Ashford died believing he had improved history by removing what he viewed as errors and by inserting what he viewed as corrections. What he had actually done was corrupt one of America's important historical collections, betray the trust of a scholarly community, and demonstrate how easily truth can be destroyed by those who believe their personal understanding of truth justifies alteration of the documentary record that society depends upon for accurate knowledge of its past.